Do you love the detail you can get with coloured pencil but want to speed up the process? I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I create drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow so that you can create realistic and professional artwork even if you're just starting out. I'm going to share some fantastic supplies and techniques that I use to help you create beautiful drawings in a shorter amount of time. One of the fastest ways to speed up coloured pencil drawings is to use Pan Pastels as the base layer or the background. And if you don't know what Pan Pastels are, they're basically a soft pastel that's been compressed into a pan. And I will leave a link to a more in-depth video in the description if you want to know more about them. But the way that you apply them is with soft tools, and that's SOFT, that's the brand name. They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, which is really helpful for filling in larger areas or smaller details. If you don't want to fork out for a huge set of pan pastels, you can actually start out with 5 colours. So you can have red, blue, yellow, black and white, and you can actually mix your colours just like paints. All you need to do is grab a spare piece of printer paper and take a little bit of each colour that you think you need and keep adding it to this printer paper until you get the colour that you're after. And then you can just apply it straight to your artwork from there. When you're using the soft sponges, make sure that you're pressing really lightly because the tools can actually wear away quite quickly if you press too hard. Once the pastel stops coming off of your tool, go back into your pan and get more pastel. Don't try to push harder to get more pastel to come off because that's one of the main reasons why people's soft tools get worn away too quickly. I'd also suggest using the larger sponges when you can because they don't wear away as quickly as the smaller blue knife tools do. When you're using pan pastels for an underpainting or a base layer, you really want to make sure that you're using really light layers so you don't fill up the tooth of the paper too quickly. And what I mean by the tooth is that basically every paper you work on has these little grooves in it. They're kind of like hills and valleys, and that's what we call the tooth. So the pastel or the pencil catches on the top of the hills and then deposits into the valleys. And once your valleys are filled up, it becomes level with the top of the hills and it creates a smooth surface where your pastel or your pencil has nothing to catch onto anymore. That's when you've filled up the tooth of the paper and you won't be able to add any more layers. So you may need to experiment with how much pastel you're adding in your base layer to make sure that you have enough tooth left for your coloured pencil on top. For me, I try to do a really light layer with the pastels just to make sure, and there's usually quite a lot of paper showing through in my base layer, which is totally normal. If you're doing a background with pan pastels and you're not planning on putting any coloured pencil on top, you can add a few more layers of the pastel there to get it to look a little bit more smooth and a bit softer looking. I did actually make a tutorial a while ago with pan pastel and coloured pencil, but the problem that I had at the time was the paper that I was using. I used Clairefontaine pastel mat in that video, and don't get me wrong, I really love that paper for pastels by themselves or even for coloured pencil by themselves. But when I mixed the two mediums, I wasn't entirely happy with the end result. And I will leave a link to that video in the description if you're interested. But the paper is really important, especially for pastels. There are a lot of papers that are labelled as pastel paper, but they just don't take many layers at all and they often look really grainy. You also may not be able to use your normal coloured pencil paper with pan pastels either. But I recently discovered the Luxe Archival sanded paper, which is a game changer for coloured pencil over the top of pan pastel. I found that with this paper, I can get a lot more layers and my coloured pencils show up really well on top of the pan pastel. Whereas on the pastel mat, I kind of felt like I was a bit limited with the amount of layers that I could add, and my coloured pencil kind of blended into the pastel a little bit. There are a lot of artists who do use the pastel mat with these supplies, but it does depend on your techniques and how many layers you want to add, and whether it will work well for you personally. I love working with pastel pencils over the top of pan pastels, but if you've ever tried to sharpen a pastel pencil, you'll know that it's really difficult to get a sharp point and keep it sharp. So using coloured pencils will allow you to get some of those finer details on top if that's what you prefer. For me, I don't tend to add a lot of fine details to my artwork. I just make it look realistic from a normal viewing distance, but when you look close, there's actually not that many details. But I know that a lot of people do like to add those details, which is one of the reasons why people love coloured pencil. One of the main questions I get about using coloured pencils over pastel is whether you need to use a fixative. So I personally don't use fixatives on any of my coloured pencil or pastel pieces because it really isn't necessary if you use the same techniques that I'm using with the same suppliers and if you frame and store your work properly. And most pastel artists will actually tell you that fixatives cause more problems than they solve. So things like yellowing, discolouring, and not actually fixing the drawing are really common problems. If you do feel as though you need to seal your pastel layer before adding coloured pencil, I have actually tried using the Spectrafix fixative, which did work pretty well. Again, I don't use it because I don't think it's necessary, even between my pastel and coloured pencil layers. But if you do choose to use that fixative, especially at the end of the piece, just keep in mind that you may need to come over the top of some areas to fix any sort of splatters or discoloration that the fixative may have caused. Using pastel pencils over the top of pan pastels is a little bit different to using coloured pencil, but this tutorial in the top left corner explains my process of using pastel pencils. So click on that and I'll see you over there.